Today for ADG Pro, we're going back to Epic Pinball again to test some stuff out, specifically real pinball flipper tricks, to see how many of them work, if any. Let's see, here's the thing. When I covered Epic Pinball on Ancient DOS games originally, it had actually been quite a while since I last played real pinball, and even then, at that point in time, I'd never learned any of the tricks the pros use when playing the real thing. After making the Epic Pinball review, I joined our local pinball league, which was quite a fair shade bigger than I expected it to be, and I've been playing real pinball on a regular basis ever since, save for an extended break I took at one point, and current global circumstances as of the making of this video. But because I'm playing with talented players, it means I've also learned all the flipper tricks now, as well as the finer points of nudging. It also means that I've barely touched the digital stuff, because I'm just gonna flat out tell you all right now, there is not a single piece of pinball software out there which correctly replicates the physics of the real thing. Every digital pinball game is different, with its own physics and its own programming, meaning in order to play these games, you kinda have to learn their own unique flavor of physics, and how to get the ball to behave the way you want it to given those physics. However, this doesn't mean the real tricks are fated to fail. Even if the physics are different, similar results might transpire. For instance, the Pinball Arcade from Farsight Studios has decent physics, but again, they're not bang-on accurate. But over time, they've been improving the physics models, and thus virtually all of the flipper tricks work in it now. Because even though the ball doesn't behave exactly like it would in a real pinball machine, the necessary aspects are now emulated, which allows the real tricks to function, such as ball spin, which is what allows for live catches, and flipper power, which is what allows for flick passes, tap passes, and drop catches. So that's the goal for today, to go through the various tables here in Epic Pinball and see what flipper tricks work in these tables. I suspect the physics model is global to all of the tables, despite them all being separate executable data, but I'm going to make sure to the greatest extent that I can, especially since the last two tables, Space Journey and Toy Factory, have slightly differently shaped flippers. The specific tricks I'm going to be testing are dead bounces, post transfers, live catches, drop catches, tap passes, and flick passes. Now, if opportunities arise to test other tricks, I'll take advantage and see what happens, but those are the 6 tricks I intend to focus on. Some of the tricks I won't be testing are shakeouts, death saves, and nearly all tricks requiring multi-ball play. Now, shakeouts are where you shake the front of the machine vigorously side to side when a ball is about to go down an outlane, to rattle it around the walls of the outlane and encourage it to travel back up and out of the outlane, which I can't do in Epic Pinball because Epic Pinball only supports forward nudges, even when you hit the side nudging keys. Now, death saves are illegal in real pinball, but even if I wanted to test them, I can't because it depends on the shape of the table below the flippers, which in all of the tables here is just a giant gaping void where it matters. As for multi-ball tricks, all the tables in Epic Pinball which have multi-ball are very stingy about getting it going, unlike in most real pinball games from the 90s onwards, where it's often really easy to get the first multi-ball going to encourage even novice players to stick around, and then it gets exponentially more difficult to achieve multi-ball the longer you can keep the game going for. Anyways, I'm going to be flipping between different tables as we go through all of these tricks, but let's start things off with the simplest trick of all, the dead bounce. All you do to perform this trick is just let a ball bounce off of a flipper without engaging it, so that it simply bounces over to the other flipper. Now, this works on a real pinball machine because the flippers, like many obstacles on the playfield, have a thick piece of rubber around them for added bounce, and helps to add extra power into the shots you take. Much to my surprise, dead bounces do work in Epic Pinball. Again, though, it doesn't feel quite right. The ball bounces over for sure, and while it does so in a similar way to the real thing, it feels a lot more dead than it should, like the ball just isn't getting as much of a bounce as I'd expect. But hey, the first trick works fine, maybe we'll have good luck with the others. Next, let's try one of my favorites, the post transfer. See, on the majority of pinball games from the 80s onwards, slingshots would be placed on the field, which would bounce the ball back into action if they fell near but not onto a flipper. Plus the shape of the non-active sides of the slingshot would help to form an in-lane, or return lane as it's sometimes called, which the ball can then roll down to be delivered to the flippers. Now, in real life, these slingshot pieces are generally just 3 posts arranged into a triangle with a rubber ring pulled tight around it with a plastic overlay placed on top for decoration. The name post transfer comes from the act of taking a ball that's cradled on one flipper and flipping it into the bottom post of the slingshot above. This momentum has to go somewhere, and given the shape of the post and the spin generated on the ball when doing this, the ball will often end up flying mostly sideways, allowing it to reach the other flipper where you can cradle it there. If you know how to do a post transfer on a particular machine, you effectively have full control over which flipper you flip from anytime you've caught the ball. So, do post transfers work in Epic Pinball? Well, sort of. The thing here is that Epic Pinball's not emulating ball spin, but it's emulating the proper shape of the slingshot. So if you can get the ball to hit the post at the right angle, the deflection angle will send the ball going in a mostly horizontal path, which achieves roughly the same result. This can happen on real pinball machines, but the more likely result is the ball spin result, which allows the ball to effectively roll across the flipper at high speed and jump to the other side. However, one thing I noticed while testing this out is that the ball never stopped moving. Sure, the ball is pretty motive on a real pin, but even there, the ball will settle down and stop if you cradle it. Here, the ball just never stops. This makes performing post transfers a bit tricky, since it relies on pretty precise positioning of the ball, so you can't just perform the transfer and expect it to work. You have to time it right based on the idle movement it's continually doing. Next, let's try something a little more advanced. My second favorite flipper trick, the live catch. And this requires some pretty precise motion of the ball to pull off, as what you're trying to do is have a ball with backspin hit a flipper that you just engaged, so that the point of impact occurs at the exact moment the flipper fully engages. When done right, the ball literally just stops dead on the flipper and then rolls into a cradle. Flip too early and the ball just bounces off of the flipper. Flip too late, and the ball gets shot back into the action by the flipper. And if the ball has no backspin, then this just doesn't work, because the less backspin the ball has, the more precise the timing needs to be, to the point where it becomes nearly impossible to time this properly. And that's what I was experiencing here in Epic Pinball. If live catches are possible, they would be literally frame perfect, since ball spin isn't emulated. Whereas in reality, if the ball's got some decent backspin on it, you can do a live catch with only moderately good timing, as opposed to perfect timing. However, I suspect even with perfect timing, it's not possible here in Epic Pinball, as a certain factors started to become evident when I started testing the rest of the tricks. See, all of the remaining tricks, the tap pass, flick pass, and drop catch, rely on a specific thing to be emulated, which is often overlooked in nearly all digital pinball programs: flipper power. In real life, the flippers only have power when they're engaging. When the flipper's not engaging, it has no power whatsoever, meaning the ball can actually push the flipper itself if it isn't fully dropped. This is how drop catches work, by abusing this property of disengaging the flipper as the ball reaches it, so that the ball can literally help push the flipper back down and lose momentum in the process, ultimately coming to a very brief stop on the flipper for easier and more precise aiming before it rolls down the flipper. Naturally, I couldn't get drop catches to work. Though that said, I had a little bit of hope for tap passes and flick passes, since these rely on being able to engage or disengage the flipper for a tiny fraction of a second, respectively. And Epic Pinball appears, at first glance, to emulate this property, since if you ever so slightly tap a flipper button, the flipper will only move up slightly and then fall back down immediately, without traveling the full distance. The same with if you let go of it for a tiny fraction of a second. The flipper only drops slightly and then re-engages to its full height. But here's the problem. Epic Pinball only emulates the flipper power to be in two states, fully off or fully on. And when the ball touches the flipper, the resulting momentum calculated is based on which of these two states the flipper is in. In real life, however, it's the motion of the flipper which generates momentum on the ball. A tap pass is when you let the ball travel down the flipper and then engage the flipper for so short a period of time that it barely moves, but even just that subtle amount of power is often enough to get the ball to jump the gap between the flippers, so that you can get it to the other side. And you would use this trick on pinball machines where post transfers are not viable for whatever reason, such as the slingshots being too far from the flippers or absent entirely. When you attempt to tap pass an Epic Pinball, the flipper power state goes from fully off to fully on, so the ball reacts as though it just got a full power shot from the edge of the flipper, resulting in an extreme amount of diagonal momentum. But funnily enough, this started to clue me in on something interesting that's going on with the physics, which we'll address a little later. But suffice to say, tap passes don't work. Flick passes don't work for the same reason, as this is a trick used when the ball is careening down an in-lane at high speed, heading for the edge of a fully engaged flipper. When the ball reaches the flipper tip, you flick the power on the flipper by releasing and repressing the button in an instant, generating just a little boost of power to help the ball clear the gap between the flippers to get it to the other side and onto the other flipper. But here, same result as attempting a tap pass, a full power diagonal shot. So yeah, the conclusions on the 6 flipper tricks I intended to try are both a little disappointing and a little surprising. Given how dead the ball feels bouncing against certain objects on most tables, I didn't expect dead bounces to work, but it was neat to see that they did. Though I did notice the jungle pinball table, themed after Jill of the Jungle, has very bouncy surfaces throughout, and comes closest to giving the player an accurate feeling over how bouncy a real pinball machine tends to be. Post transfers really surprised me, as I didn't expect this to work at all without ball spin being a thing. But again, the wacky way the ball is being processed led to some issues with this, so while it does work, its reliability can be questionable in some circumstances. And then the rest of the tricks just didn't work at all. However, remember at the very beginning of the video I said you kinda have to learn the unique flavor of physics each of these pinball games has, and have to learn how to get the ball to behave the way you want it to given those physics? Well, something I noticed as I was playing Epic Pinball here is that the amount of momentum imparted into the ball while engaging a flipper is directly proportional to how close the ball is to the tip of the flipper. The closer to the tip, the more momentum the ball gets. This is also how it works on real pinball machines, but even on a real pinball machine there is a lot of force imparted with the ball near the base, whereas here, it's not actually all that much force. With this in mind, I experimented for a bit and managed to come up with a 7th brand new flipper trick, which I've dubbed the Floater Pass, named after the floater pitch from the old baseball movie Rookie of the Year, since that's effectively how this works. By engaging the flipper while the ball's rolling down it, but still very near the base, the ball only gets enough upward momentum to go partway up the table, but is still carrying its horizontal momentum. Then you just hold up the other flipper, and because of how dead the ball tends to react to the flippers, it gets caught and cradled almost every time. I got this trick working pretty consistently on most tables in the game, but I need to stress very clearly that this is not a real pinball flipper trick. You could theoretically do it, but you'd have to be able to magically get the flipper to only go up part way, somewhere between the instantaneous action of a tap or flick, but not up to the fraction of a second of power that goes into a full flip, meaning you'd have to somehow be able to consistently control the strength of your flips on the order of milliseconds. I'm pretty sure virtually the entire human population of the planet lacks the ability to do that. I also did get to try some other tricks when I got the chance. Lane nudges, for instance, seem to work just fine. The idea being that if the ball is going for the lanes, but you can't tell if it's going for an in lane or out lane, don't even give it a chance to pick one. Do a forward nudge just as the ball hits the top of the lane so that the lane guide itself will forcibly bounce the ball out of that area entirely. This works in real life, and it works in here too. I also got into multi-ball on the crash and burn table at one point and managed to get both balls onto my left flipper, giving me a chance to attempt a cradle separation. The idea being to flip one ball up off of the flipper while keeping the other ball on by just doing a quick flip, similar to if you were trying to do a post transfer. Then, while the first ball is out of the way, taking a full flip at the other ball, and then keeping the flipper held up to catch and cradle the first ball as it comes back down. I only got one chance to attempt this, and it kinda worked, though Crash and Burn doesn't actually have slingshots. Those triangular pieces are just solid walls. In real life, a ball needs to push into a slingshot to trigger it, meaning if the ball is rolling beside the slingshot without pushing into it, the slingshot won't engage. But here in Epic Pinball, it just needs to hit the collision area to trigger it. So if this were any other table in the game with slingshots instead of walls above the flippers, this wouldn't have worked. I was even instinctively trying slap saves when I wasn't sure if the ball was going to reach a flipper or not, despite the fact that the game doesn't emulate sideways nudges despite having buttons for them. A slap save is when you press a flipper button and do a sideways nudge in one solid motion, often looking like you're slapping the machine, which shifts the ball ever so slightly towards that side of the machine, making it easier to get the flipper on that side to hit the ball if it looked like it might just barely miss it and go down the drain. I'm pretty sure it wasn't actually doing much of anything here. Lastly, we'll talk about the unusual nature of the final two tables, Space Journey and Toy Factory. The reason the flippers were redesigned here is because these two tables incorporate a device known as a center post. See these dots on the playfield here? Yeah, these are not just decoration. In real life, these would be singular posts with a tiny ring of rubber on them. The center posts are generally used to allow the flippers to be further apart without sacrificing playtime. However, the center posts on these two tables are kinda weird. I mean, not completely weird because they function pretty much exactly as I'd expect them to. In fact, they function almost too well. Well, on a real pinball machine with a center post, the post would be much lower, so that the ball would never end up stuck between the post and the flipper, which seemed to sometimes happen on these two tables. And beyond that, the post behaves fairly closely to the real thing, whereby if you do a forward nudge just as the ball hits the post dead on, the ball will bounce back up a good bit so that you have a solid chance to get it onto a flipper. Now, if the ball hits the sides of the post, then it doesn't matter, and it's still going to drain as expected, just like on the real thing. Other than that, despite the altered shape and motion of the flippers, they function exactly like the flippers on the other tables. So yeah, that concludes my attempt to get real flipper tricks working in Epic Pinball. If you want to learn more about these tricks and see them in action on real pinball machines, I'll have links in the video description to some pages to check out. Other than that, all I can say really is that, for the most part, you can't treat digital pinball like real pinball. Even if some tricks work and some tricks don't, they ultimately feel nothing alike. It takes different skills to play both well, and while there's a little bleed over, you really are talking about two totally different things. Anyways, that'll be all for today's episode of ADG Pro. Next Saturday will be a proper review, episode 272, and we're going to be covering a game I've wanted to cover on ADG since the very first episode, but which has proven incredibly elusive. Until now. And hey, same publisher as this one even, so be sure to stay tuned for it. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small selection of you guys. What the heck? I didn't even know Super Android had a multi-ball mode.